So we're very fortunate to have an esteemed panel here of corporate social responsibility leaders, and they're also Gabelli School alums. And they're going to be sharing their insights and ideas on how to leverage the power of business as a force for positive change. So I want to start with my first question on the field and how it's evolved over time, corporate social responsibility. When you think about how the role of a CSR professional has changed since you've been in the field, what would you say some of those changes are? So I want to ask this question to each of our panelists, and then we'll go from there. So Arlene, let's start with you.
Well, thank you, Lerzan.
Please.
And I think, now can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you for the invitation to be on the panel. It's great to be back at Fordham University, and when Fordham calls, I always answer. I have had a different sort of career track. I am a finance person. I am a CPA, a CFA, been a credit analyst, have run businesses both in the United States and in Europe for Moody's Corporation. And so this is, to some extent, was an unlikely path for me. And to give you some perspective on how I believe that corporate social responsibility as a function is evolving, I'll give you a little bit of my story. I was managing our operations from London, running the business for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Clearly in Europe, there was more of a fast track towards corporate social responsibility, where our customers primarily were seeking vendors that aligned with their values. And so from a business perspective, that was my observation. At the same time, Moody's then president of the foundation was retiring. The company had always supported my activities in nonprofits. I'd been on a number of large nonprofit boards while I worked. And so the leadership team came over and asked if I would consider being president of the Moody's Foundation. And so understand, I've always been in a P&L role, follow the money, right? And so when they asked, I said, thank you, I really appreciate the consideration, but frankly, it's not that compelling. Because not unless you're willing to consider a broad and overarching corporate responsibility strategy, and one that is intersected with the business. So that was the first conversation. The next conversation was around, and by the way, I don't want my compensation structure to change. So we're not doing the nonprofit in a corporate foundation. I want a comp structure that aligns with the business, with achievable goals, just like I had when I ran a P&L. So that took a lot of doing, but after a couple of months, they agreed to do that. And what I'd say is that is indicative of sort of moving from, and when we prepped for this panel, we had this discussion, this aspect of philanthropy to really social impact, and what it means for long-term value of an organization, that you have professionals who understand the business, understand the values of the organization and its stakeholders, and is sitting at the table for strategy.
Thank you, Arlene. Meg?
I agree completely. The biggest change, I think, is kind of going from this kind of historically checkbook philanthropy to really aligning it with the business, as Arlene mentioned. I also think that there's much greater pressure from both kind of internal and external stakeholders than there really ever has been before. When the previous panel was talking about the expectations of young professionals, that really kind of resonated with me, because we're seeing the same thing in our field. This younger generation that's coming into the workforce, they want to see companies not just talking the talk, but walking the walk. And if you're putting out these big, lofty statements and there's no action behind it, you're going to get called out. That's just the reality today.
Great. So, hi everyone. I'm Allison. I run a company called 7th Generation. For those of you that don't know, we make natural home care and personal care products. And I'm going to start with the company in answering this question before I get to my personal perspective. So 7th Generation has been in business for 3 decades. A lot of people don't know that we've been around that long. And it's really a really important part of our story because our founders were light years ahead of their time and really built the business on holding people, planet, and profit in balance, which really was the inception of CSR, right? And so 7th Generation as a company has been designed to deliver this. And as part of that, we have a mission, right? To transform the world into a healthy, sustainable, and equitable place for the next 7th generation. And it truly is how we run the business, from decisions that we make in terms of what we put in our products to how we advocate and use our voice to amplify reasons for change and how we educate consumers. And now that's been just how we've operated, right? So when people ask me like about CSR, I was like, I don't even really think like that, right? I think about how 7th Generation runs and how we've been able to really use our business model as a catalyst for change. Now, for me personally, I've been with the company for about a decade. So even in my 10 years in this space, I've seen this transform radically. So when I joined the company, it was like this super niche idea. And a lot of people, especially in traditional business sense, were a little bit confused. Like, you don't believe in profitability? I'm like, no, so I do. But what you choose to do with profitability needs to be the conversation that all of us are having. And so it really was this niche sort of challenge the status quo idea when I joined the company. And now what we've really seen, right, within our walls and certainly in our industry and in our space is so many companies, right, all the way through Fortune 500 companies now adopting CSR strategies, setting net zero goals, which is incredible. I think we all really need to hold business accountable for driving the changes that we need in the world. And so to see these huge companies, multinational companies really adopting CSR strategies, putting together teams, really being public about their goals is super amazing. I think the one thing that I would just add as I close on this point, though, is that with great scale, though, does come, some challenge in really what it authentically means. And so what I have observed, certainly over the last, 1 to 2 years, is that we're starting to water this down a little bit. And a lot of the net zero goals that companies are setting are either getting pushed out further, getting cut, or not actually being accomplished. And so as a company at 7th Gen, we've really started to challenge a little bit the net zero construct and start to talk about real zero, which is about putting plans in place, putting your money where your mouth is, literally, when it comes to sustainability and being proof points for change. And so I think it'll be very interesting to see where the next 5 years take us. As somebody in the business seat and controlling the P&L, I think it's a really, really tough time to be, funding a lot of these sustainability decisions. I feel that in my business. I can only imagine what it feels like when you're running, billions and billions of dollars. But I think, certainly want to make sure that we're all holding the responsibility that this change is needed. And I think business will be much more effective at driving that change than certainly the government will.
That was great, thank you. And hi, everyone, I'm Jordan. It's lovely to meet you. I have come to CSR in what I always like to say is probably the first generation of folks that got into it very directly. I'm a 2015 graduate of the Gabelli School at the undergraduate level, and I'm one of the oldest people I know who started their career in CSR as opposed to getting into it from other fields, which I think just speaks to how it's really taken on a life of its own and become a legitimate career path as a CSR practitioner. So in the last 8 years or so, I've had generalist roles. I work myself in the apparel and supply chain industry. There's no shortage of jobs and attention and all these things we're seeing now. To Allison's point, there's real momentum that the business community needs to take, but from a personal sort of CSR practitioner point of view, how I've seen actually just my role change over the last 7 to 8 years, 2 things really stick out. Having worked at very apples-to-apples jobs and places in my industry and in the jobs that I've had, one big difference is when I started in 2015-16, the question I got from senior leaders was always, why should I care? Why should I care about the environment? Why should I care about communities? Frankly, why should I care about our employees? We haven't gotten that much farther from there, but at least the question has changed. It's how do I care about the environment? How do I care about communities? And how do I care for our employees? It might seem small, but the distinction is very real. We as the CSR experts are not making that business case for doing the right thing. Leaders get it. Leaders get it, even if they get it from a cynical risk perspective, we need raw materials to source one day sort of way. They get it, and that's been really huge. The second piece is the stakeholders we're talking about have changed, and this is really apparent in my industry. We're very consumer driven, but we're moving away from some of these kind of gotcha questions that put us in a fickle place, which is, will customers pay a little bit more for that organic cotton t-shirt or recycled packaging? At the end of the day, if we're really good marketers, they're gonna buy whatever we sell them, right? We're listening to other stakeholders. We're listening to legislation that's being passed around the, around the world. We're listening to our employees as real stakeholders, knowing this is what they're looking for in the places that they want to work. And all that kind of collective action, I think, is moving us really quickly further ahead than where we were even when I started my career.
Mm-hmm. Jordan, you spoke about how the mindset has changed and the questions that are being asked have changed. And so this next question I'm going to direct to you. By the way, Jordan also teaches classes here in her free time. She teaches courses here to our business undergraduates. So what do you think the CSR within companies is going to look like in the future? When you look at 5 years ahead or 10 years ahead, what does that look like? And being in the classroom and engaging with the leaders of tomorrow, what are some of the career paths that you see for our graduates? And are there any type of misconceptions that you observe in young talent when it comes to your field and your area?
Yeah, so one of the most fascinating things, especially after that last panel we just heard, is since 2019, I've had 65, 20, 21, 22-year-olds kind of at my disposal to really listen to what are they gravitating towards? What are they looking for? I started teaching prior to the pandemic, and I'm still teaching. It's really interesting. I kind of just sit there and go, would you work for them? Would you do that? Do you want these kinds of jobs? And I've noticed a few patterns. Over the years, the number of students who legitimately are planning for a career path in some sort of ESG function, some sort of CSR, corporate philanthropy, environmental reporting, whatever that may be, has increased. I started with maybe one student in all of my sections who was considering it as a career path to, I think I have 6 or 7 this year who are literally planning to go into this. And that's over the course of 3 years in a pandemic. But I noticed that same shift is happening with all my students. The continuum is kind of just progressing forward. So of course not everyone is planning to do this. There's a million other great careers that come out of the Gabelli School, but I'm noticing it trickle down as well. So my extra altruistic students are going into CSR. My slightly engaged students know that it's going to be part of their work and they're interested in those topics. They know that whether they go into accounting, they might need to know the SASB standards, or if they were going to be some sort of analyst, there's job opportunity in the environmental analysis field. It continues to trickle though. My really staunch, traditional students, my iBankers, my marketers, which make up the bulk of my students, still know why this is important to them. They're still looking at employers in this way. They go, it might not be my job, but I want to know that it's someone's job at this organization. They're looking up what their companies are lobbying for and against. They're really thinking about ethics as a 360 thing. In my class, we look at the news and statements and commitments that were made by, the Big Four and other companies in 2020 around employee well-being, around racial justice, around all these things. And people are looking at if companies are following through. And even if you're going to be an accountant, they are considering these things. The language that my students know overnight feels different. I used to be explaining these acronyms like crazy, and now they just get them and know them. And that's definitely not through my teaching. So who's to say really what this field is going to look like in the future? But if I could wave a magic wand or look into a crystal ball, I don't think, so long as capitalism keeps sort of beating on and inequality and climate demise persist, we will have job security forever. But I think we might be getting away from, and I'd love to see us, frankly, getting away from a job where my title is CSR manager. I don't need to be in a silo. We can all sort of adopt the practices that 7th Gen, for example, have been doing for a decade plus. We don't need to be in a silo when everyone on the marketing team knows the FTC guidelines around greenwashing. You don't need, a separate environmental analysis team when ESG reporting is just part of our investor relations team. I don't think we'll need to do that, and hopefully we're moving in that direction.
Those are such great comments, and I very much hope we have something to do with with our students and
Big time.
Okay, so I want to now turn to Arlene. Corporations have received great pressure, right, in terms of increased focus on ESG from stakeholders. So this increase in transparency and the need for transparency and disclosure is also leading to much more information on comparability and around standardization. So how has that momentum really transformed what you called corporate philanthropy, right, at the beginning of your comments, to be more aligned with the goals of long-term value creation?
And it's to some extent piling on what Jordan just talked about, right? And if you recall, I said what is important is that you're at the strategy table, that you're not siloed. My role at Moody's at the time, I viewed really more as a change management role, where you were introducing something that was going to impact every aspect of the company, from commercial operations to how we access the capital market, to how we really looked at companies we were ourselves assessing. This whole aspect of sort of corporate philanthropy was one of the most significant things I had to grapple in terms of the change management. We'd had a very successful foundation where our employees felt very proud of the work that had been done. But when you're going through the process of really sort of standardizing and making this a concrete part of the strategy, and you start looking at, okay, what is the business, and what does this mean for our stakeholders broadly, which means shareholders, customers, employees, regulators, and the communities that we're doing business in. What do they prioritize, and how does that align with our business? Mm-hmm. It takes on a very different perspective. And sometimes it requires significant modifications from sort of traditional things that we've done. So to give you an example, what that means. Moody's is a financial services company. And what we do is risk management and data analytics. We are experts in credit. So from my perspective, and after doing what is referred to as a materiality assessment, it did not make sense to fund things in health. Not that we didn't think health was important, but it wasn't directly aligned with our business. And so we went through the exercise of saying, how do we change the world for positive in a way that makes sense for what it is that we do? And if you're really looking at long-term value, 30, 40 years down the road, how do you do that in a way that enhances the value of the organization? So switching from sort of, and take this with a grain of salt, kind of arbitrary passion, philanthropic initiatives to one where it's aligned with the business, we moved from a diverse sort of perspective of passion projects to there are three things we're going to do, three things we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on financial knowledge for small and growing businesses owned by women and people of color, because the greatest challenge that they have is accessing capital, and the greatest challenge in that is understanding credit. And by the way, if you can solve the issue for small and growing businesses, They create a predominant amount of jobs in the emerging and developed economies, and they also contribute significantly to GDP. So that is sort of concrete, and our folks could get behind that and understand how that transforms to the bottom line. And I even had one of our senior leaders said, well, small businesses, that's not our business. And I said, think about if you had helped Google or Facebook 20 years ago, what the brand loyalty would be for you today. And the lights went on. So that's sort of, from my perspective, what it means for the transformation of corporate philanthropy. But it also means that you have to move from an aspect of storytelling to really quantitative metrics on what you're trying to accomplish, and it has to be auditable and reportable, to the point around the accounting profession.
Now I want to turn to Meg. You work in the apparel industry. Can you share how PVH has leveraged some of the collaboration to address industry-wide issues?
Definitely. And so I work for PVH, which is the parent company of Tommy Hilfiger and Calvin Klein. Nobody's heard of PVH, but everyone's heard of our brands. So an example of industry collaboration that I'm particularly proud of, and I think it's also something unique about working in this space, that I have the ability to collaborate so frequently with peer companies that are traditionally considered competitors. I don't know how much of that goes on the business side. But we recently created an industry pooled fund called the Resilience Fund for Women in Global Value Chains. And this came about in the very early days of COVID. Back in April of 2020, I was part of a weekly call series with a number of peers in my industry. And we kind of used those calls as an open forum to talk about the challenges that we were having at the time, because we were all in very similar situations. Our stores were closed, our employees were furloughed, budgets were tight, the needs from our nonprofit partners were really greater than they had ever been before. And on one of those calls, somebody had brought up the idea of potentially pooling our funds to focus on one specific area to really kind of maximize our impact, because resources were so tight at that time. We talked about it for a few minutes, we moved on. My colleague who had been on the call with me, who sits on our corporate responsibility team, she manages our women's empowerment programs in our supply chain. She had followed up with me and she said, I really liked that idea of an industry pooled fund. I want to talk about that more. So we kind of brainstormed, and we were talking about focusing that kind of pooled effort on our supply chain workforce. So our supply chain workforce is almost 80% female. We know that women were so disproportionately impacted by COVID. They're living and working in countries that lacked the social safety nets that we had here, right? They weren't getting their unemployment checks. They weren't getting a $600 a week stipend. They didn't necessarily have access to quality healthcare if they were to get sick. So we kind of came up with this idea. We said we're going to bring it back to the group next week. So we get on the next call. We're like, this is what we were thinking about. What does everyone think? And it was like crickets. It was a very, very lukewarm reception. We had one company that kind of raised their hand. That was the Gap, that expressed some interest in it. So we continued to kind of have conversations offline. Weren't getting a ton of traction. And finally, we decided to reach out to the UN Foundation, the Universal Access Project. We had worked with them previously, and they have programs focused around women's health. And when we approached the UN Foundation, they absolutely loved the idea. They had managed pooled funds before, so they had all these ideas around governance structure and things that we hadn't even started to think about. They thought it was something that would be appealing to other funders. So we really then kind of spent the next few months, it was PVH, the Gap, and the UN Foundation, just conceptually kind of hashing through what the fund would look like. So we didn't want it to be another COVID emergency fund. So many of those were popping up. We really wanted it to address those kind of root problems that were making women so susceptible to these types of disasters in the first place, and making sure that we addressed those systemic challenges. So the fund is focused on women's safety, on bodily autonomy, and sexual and reproductive health, and geographically focused in the regions where we have our supply chain. So India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Cambodia. And the UN Foundation, through their incredible network, was able to bring on board a brilliant group of nonprofit and women's fund leaders whose input has been invaluable in developing the fund. So by the fall of 2020, we actually got H&M and VF on board to join us. and they were able to kind of help continue to craft what the fund would look like. And then we launched it publicly last spring, so the spring of 2021. And since then, we've had Ralph Lauren, Lululemon, Avery Dennison, Amazon. I know I'm forgetting some, but we've had all these other funders come on board, and it's been so incredible to see it come to life. Our advisory board, which is our governing body, is 100% female. So it's really a fund for women that's managed by women. And I think kind of my two takeaways from the entire experience was, one, if you have an idea and it's a good idea and it's meeting a need, be persistent, follow through. Don't let people saying no kind of discourage you. And at the time, it felt like we were getting a lot of resistance. But when I look back, it was 1 year from when we came up with the idea to when we actually launched the fund. That's incredible. And the second thing is just the power of collaboration. So I mentioned, these brilliant people that I'm so lucky to work with, but I mean, I never imagined back in 2020 the incredible group that this would bring together. We all have very unique experiences, unique resources, unique kind of different expertise, and no single one of us or no single one of our companies or our organizations could have the kind of impact that we're having now as this collaborative group.
That is just such an amazing example of industry collaboration. I mean, really, congratulations.
Thank you.
I want to turn over to Allison. When we look at Gen Z and Gen Alpha, they're much more critical when it comes to large corporations and consumption, right? There's also currently, we're reading in the paper, in the media, a huge backlash against ESG, especially when it comes to greenwashing and brownwashing. So, as seventh generation, right? How does your company view CSR as a tool for both relevance and also authenticity?
Yeah, great. So I will answer this in a similar way to the way I addressed the first question, but I'll build on a little bit more. So I think, again, CSR being so deeply woven in the identity of seventh generation, I think radical transparency and authenticity have always been values of the company. And that's just really how we were raised as a company, is that we talked about everything that we did, the good and the bad. So one of the things that seventh generation was on the leading edge of in 2003 was actually publishing a transparency report on how we were doing from a sustainability perspective, an impact perspective, and a people perspective. And so I think because it's been so deeply embedded in who we are as a company, that's something that we still do today. And many of our consumers and customers are looking to that, one, to understand how we are doing, and then two, looking to us to say, what's the next chapter of this type of reporting? What does raising the bar look like when it comes to being radically transparent from a corporate perspective? So I think, that's, to your point, I think those pieces are incredibly important to this younger generation, and I think I'm super grateful for that, knowing that it's a big piece of being able to future fit our business model, right? I'm like, I can't wait for these younger generations to have buying power, because I know it's going to really serve our company super duper well. Watching the ESG kind of news happen has been super interesting from my vantage point. I think obviously some of it being so politically motivated right now. But the one thing that I would say, and that I certainly hold as like my purpose in my role, is that let the results speak for themselves. Mm-hmm. So we don't really participate in any of this ESG back and forth, because I'm like, great, let me show you the business model for how this works. When I can show you the results in real time about how a business delivers profitability, sustainability, social impact, caring for the world around them, it's not really a debate as to whether or not this is a distraction or not for companies. It's actually the business model that we all need to be emulating. So that's really where I focus. A lot of times I talk about really proving the business case of sustainability, the pros and the challenges that come along with that, especially in today's financially constrained economy. But I think that's just a really, really important piece for those of us in business and financial holding seats, is just to make sure you're really letting the results show the way for other people, and then showing that to the industry. Look, so here's how we can do this. This is how we have to scale these ingredients. This is how we come together to really commercialize and make sure that we're driving adoption of these types of materials. Just in closing on this point, I think one of the interesting bridges that I'm hearing through this conversation is, where does CSR sit, right? So I think in many companies, it's like a siloed group, or it can be like a smaller team. I think one of the things that has allowed us to be successful in actually executing on a lot of these things is, in our company, it is a standalone team. We call them corporate consciousness. I think everyone has their own name for it. But our lead, so our chief impact officer, sits on our decision-making team. And it's her role on that cross-functional team to hold us accountable to the long-term goals that we've set. So that's everything from how we're spending our marketing dollars in any given year to the projects that we're approving in our product portfolio. So does our innovation help us to accomplish our goals? Are we approving the projects that are going to allow us to more locally source an ingredient to help to reduce our carbon footprint? So it's just an important thing to thread through here, is that not only is it what is CSR, but how you treat CSR within your organization, that I think really allows you to enable it.
Do we have any other comments about that particular question from our other panelists? No?
I think that is sort of spot on in terms of really making sure that it's an overarching philosophy for the company and not siloed somewhere.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, the stakeholders will weigh in terms of the authenticity of whatever strategy or initiative you're talking about. And if it doesn't prove in the results, it's going to be worse than if you didn't do it at all.
Right, absolutely. So before we turn it over to the audience for Q&A, and I hope each of you are thinking through what questions you might want to ask, I have one last question, and I'm going to ask Arlene. You're on a lot of boards. As in terms of your service to these boards, how do you see the role of boards evolving in terms of social impact and making it central?
So I'm one of those quiet quitters. I decided to retire, and I retired in June of this year, but also transitioned to corporate board service. I'm on 3 public company boards, all different industries. One is the largest food service provider in the world with 500,000 employees, and certainly, many of those are frontline and diverse employees. Another is a real estate company. Certainly climate issues are prevalent there. And then third, a financial services company. And so from a board perspective, it was interesting because I'd always envisioned sort of my next thing was what I wanted to do, corporate board service. It's great when sort of everything aligns, and I think having sort of a finance background and then being in a corporate social responsibility or ESG strategy role made me particularly interested in this time and place. You both had the issue on climate change, you had the George Floyd murder and sort of the social movement surrounding that. I mentioned Europe and sort of being very intentional on driving the agenda forward. And so from a board perspective, what you're really doing is providing support for the management team on the execution of the strategy, but also oversight of enterprise risk management. And if you think about sort of corporate social responsibility in the context of that and everything my panelists said, it is the intersection of driving long-term value and risk management. So it is prevalent in the board discourse. What is interesting is it also requires a collaboration between audit committees and nom-gov committees or corporate social responsibility committees, because the reporting and the accuracy of that to avoid being accused of greenwashing or to ensure that you're set up to meet regulatory requirements requires collaboration between those two sort of bodies. And so I'm really excited about where it stands in terms of the board conversation. It's just one fascinating conversation I had recently where one of our, you're on a board, so it's all kinds of people on the board, and one of our board members said, well, new administration, all this SEC stuff on climate change is going to change. And the CEO said, well, actually, that's not what's driving it. What's driving it is in our investor meetings, they're asking about climate change and ESG all the time. So if we want to be efficient about how we're accessing the capital markets, we've got to make this transformation.
Thank you, Arlene. Thank you. All right, now it's your turn. If you have any questions for our panelists, yes.
I'm on the heels of coming back from the Half Earth Day Project in DC and Smithsonian. One of the executives, I want to get the name correct, Ani Dasgupta, shared with us that this industry of climate economy is $26 trillion. Right? So I know you CSR and that's fine, but it's not going anywhere and they're intertwined. And so I'm really interested in how Fordham in particular are preparing women in particular and perhaps even the outside community to be prepared for a new economy that I know is coming online as early as 2035, the wind turbine industry. I was given a full presentation on that from the NAACP, and I want to be sure that our students, community, is prepared to come into that industry, not just on a work level of maintenance, but on the climate level of creating and investing in the construction of those wind turbines, the steel industry, and from an investment perspective, what can we do to prepare everybody?
Well, I can certainly speak to what we're doing at Fordham, but if our panelists want to comment on what are some of the things that might be important for students to understand. This morning you heard from Tanya, our president, about how important this is for our university. And specifically at the business school, we're actually employing and innovating in a number of different ways. Whether it's in the curriculum, our students, before they come in, they take an ESG boot camp. They understand what are some of the terminologies, language, why is it important, what is it about environmental social governance, and the impact on business that they need to understand. And they take a ground floor course, which is the Introduction to Business course. They learn about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. They actually come up with a business plan to address that. And through our collaboration with PVH, which has been amazing for the past 5 years, we've been able to run a competition with students and highlighting really the teams that have done a very good job of addressing those. Our students learn how to read sustainability reports. They understand the supply chain issues. So we have majors and minors in sustainable accounting, and one of our relationships is with SASB, the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, which has now become ISSB, and so the whole alphabet soup. But so we're very passionate, and we really believe in educating our students in these topics and making sure that they're literate, but also understand why it's important for the business case. I know that all of them understand this is the right thing to do, but it's also, yes, right. You said it's a $1 trillion industry, so you made the business case right at the beginning, and they have to understand what it means for profitability as well. So regardless of what careers they pursue, that's what they get here. So I hope that answers your question.
Can I just add one other thing? I, particularly given sort of my generation, right? I turned 63 this week. So this space, it was interesting because what I found was my entire team was under 40 when I was at Moody's. And they were passionate, innovative, and knowledgeable. And so it takes us of this generation to really listen. What they may not have is sort of the savvy to maneuver politically inside an organization, and that's where we come in, right? But the other thing I would say is it's important that we encourage innovation and entrepreneurship, because much of what will happen is not currently in the technological footprint of many companies, and it's going to take somebody who's going to think outside the box to really accelerate progress. And so oftentimes in business schools, we talk about or prepare students for a career in a corporation, but I think it's also incredibly important that we take some time to expose them to the option of entrepreneurship and encourage their innovation.
Absolutely, and for that, we have the Fordham Foundry, right? Yes, so we actually do have a new business incubator. Well, actually, it's our hub of innovation and entrepreneurship, and we have our 10th anniversary, actually, celebrating right in this room, right, next week. So you're all invited if you'd like to join us. But it is so important to develop those skills.
I'd love to add a slightly provocative thought to
Yes,
this.
please.
I think a lot about this. And in fact, the IRA passed, last month, so the money is here now to really help us right now with renewable energy. So I would say, we're in the moment where we need those entrepreneurs and we need those solutions. And, I think I'm excited to hear that we're teaching this in classrooms, because when I was in undergrad and graduate level education, we weren't really talking about this stuff. So I think it's incredible to hear Fordham really weaving it through all of their different curriculum streams, because to the point, it's not a standalone. The thing that I would really have us think about is that if we're thinking about climate solutions now, actually we're too late. Training people right now, especially at the undergrad level around renewable energy, is like, training people about coal, to be honest with you. What we need to be really educating our people on is what are they doing around climate change challenges, solutions to infrastructure. I mean, climate change is going to be here. Cities are going to be underwater. How are we going to be preparing this next generation to actually think about how we prepare to live in a climate change world, beyond just like thinking that it's coming and how are we going to prevent it? And so, I would just make a strong case for that being more deeply ingrained in how we're especially teaching at the undergrad level, because that's where I believe the big thinking needs to happen.
Yeah. Thank you. Other questions? Oh, there's someone back there.
Hi, thank you so much for all of your remarks so far. I'm Allison, also with 1L. I graduated from Fordham in 2021, and you mentioned, I think all of you at some point, looking toward Europe for inspiration in terms of the corporate responsibility space. I just spent the past year in Madrid, Spain, on a Fulbright living there, so really interested in that relationship as well. So my question is, when you're looking for inspiration, whether that be from Europe or in America, what countries do you think what companies are really leading this space, and like what are they doing that makes them inspirations to you in all of your work?
So can I? Okay, so I would say I'm not looking for Europe for inspiration. Again, it's more in the context of what is driving the forces forward in Europe versus in the United States. And because there's a regulatory regime around reporting and standardization that already exists in Europe, what is happening is for multinational companies in the United States to compete, where in some cases, if you're a large vendor, you at some point will have to disclose, for instance, scope 3 emissions, right? And so if you're a European company that is already putting in place that framework because you have to, you'll have a competitive advantage over a US competitor. So it's I know you said inspiration, but it's more like looking at the competitive landscape and figuring out how to at least compete effectively or at least lead in an industry. I mean, there are a host of companies that are really innovative around sort of some of the things that they're doing. I believe more strongly in the ones that can demonstrate that it has an impact either on their future bottom line, their access to capital, or their competitive position. So I'm a little more black and white than sort of inspiration.
Yeah, and what I would add to that too is it's not inspiration, it's legislation. From where I sit, I know that that's what's going to make my C-suite respond, is having to. We've talked a lot about energy, but obviously that's not the only climate issue either. I'm really involved in leather legislation in the work that I do because I've mostly worked for houses of leather. There's big legislation being passed in Europe around tracing leather and relating it back to deforestation risks in the Amazon and other places. That's what's getting us to move. I think there's peer companies we all look at as inspiration in design, in market share, in customer base, in marketing, and any of these things, perhaps in sustainability, but having to, in my experience, is the best way to do it, is the best way to, having to is the best way to do.
Great, I can chime in. I think from my vantage point, I think what I tend to study and really take note of is companies that are challenging the status quo and proving that different business models are possible. So I'm sure the Patagonia news a couple weeks ago is very much in everyone's mind, but I think they created a brand new business model where Earth is a shareholder, which is, in my world, like the biggest thing possible. And so, moments like that, I think, give me extreme hope that we will be able to rebuild business to be able to serve more than just profitability. And I think, the more examples that we have of that to hold up and say, look, it is possible to do things differently, I think really are the things that get me out of bed in the morning.
I just want to say thank you to our panel. This has been just so amazing to have this esteemed group here. A big hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Lerzan, and all our panelists for that one more extraordinary panel this afternoon. For those of you who are here for the retention discussion, Jackie Quinn commented that when you're interviewing, you should be sure to speak to as wide a cross-section of individuals in an institution as you can to really understand what the place is about. So I was thinking about that in the course of the day, that if you were taking the group of women we have heard from as individual speakers, as panelists, the pioneering women we honored, if you took that as a cross-section of the women of Fordham, look at all we've learned. Look at all we've learned today. Every single woman in the mix, probably in the room, but in the mix of our speakers and panelists and honorees, has energy and enthusiasm and insights to share with all of us. They've all built on their own experiences and accomplishments, and they reflect on those experiences and accomplishments, and they brought perspective and expertise to all of us today. So whether it's a 60-year career in calling like Sister Anne has, or someone brand new getting herself immersed in Fordham and arriving at this day as Nishi has, or any of us in between in that whole spectrum of our professional and personal lives, we learned about the displays of women's redefining leadership, bringing attunement to the world, transformative activity, strategy. How many times did we hear that word today? Working through fears, discussing possibilities. We just spoke for a moment about the notion of upending, upsetting, challenging business models, challenging the status quo, challenging your employer, all the different ways, challenging oneself. All those aspects of life were brought to bear today, personal and professional, by the extraordinary array of women we had the opportunity to hear from. It's a moment, and the idea that we could together know the importance of paying it forward by seeing from 60 years ago to today what women contribute, and when we pay it forward, the possibilities for the women who are coming kind of right behind us. I have 3 tiny granddaughters. I didn't have them the last time we were together. It's been a pandemic miracle in my family, but I think about them all the time, and I think about today and what it's going to be like for them to be sitting in this kind of room, 20 years from now. And Nietzsche and other people will be here sharing their expertise, This all goes back to the start of the conversation this morning that everybody, whether overtly or covertly, talked about, which is effective activism. An Ignatian notion, a feminist notion, a business notion, a changing the world notion, effective activism, and it's been demonstrated here today. And one of the things about women in philanthropy is that's an aspect of effective activism. When we get together, when we collectively combine resources and give to Fordham or give to other institutions or areas we're committed to in those places with a shared vision, the world changes and we change it. So I want to thank you all very, very much for being here. It's been my sincere pleasure to be part of this effort. I also want to mention, and Kathleen Adams, if you were here for the Entrepreneurship and Innovation and Transformation panel, Kathleen commented that the world is a very serious place, and indeed it is. So it's important, and part of her work and her business model, to maximize opportunities for people to have fun. So on that basis, for those of you who are staying for the reception, you'll have some fun. And you'll move into the Soden Lounge in the Bateman Room right outside this room, and that will start in the next several minutes. I want to thank you all for coming, thank our corporate sponsors and our team from development for making this day an extraordinary one. And we look forward to welcoming you next year. Thank you very, very much.